شكرا كثير. عفوا. It was a pleasure being here. We'll say أهلا وسهلا. مرحبا. And I have to say that I was really intrigued by the general topic of this conference, geopolitics and transport. And actually, the more I thought about it, the more I realized that it does actually affect very much security issues today, also from the perspective of NATO as an alliance. Dr. Yuri mentioned before that NATO in its essence is a European idea. That is very much true. Originally, the British and the French came together in 1947 for the so-called Dunkirk Agreement or Treaty, with the aim of making sure that Germany would not represent a threat anymore. And then as the situation in Europe became worse and worse, and the Soviet threat more and more apparent, the Brussels Treaty was signed together with the Benelux countries. But the British realized that this was actually too much of a challenge for only these countries, and that is why big irony took place in 1948 and 1949, and that is when British Labour government and the British Labour Foreign Secretary, Ernest Bevin, basically managed to convince the Americans to engage in this alliance. He managed to convince the Truman administration to do that, which is, by the way, also why the residence of the U.S. ambassador at NATO is called the Truman Hall. So this truly was a major achievement to get the Americans to go beyond their ingrained dictum inherited from the first president, George Washington, who said, "Beware of entangling alliances." And that is why, basically, every about 10 years, there is some sort of a conversation going on with the NATO, with the Americans, about this particular arrangement, and I think that you can also observe it today. But it is also because of this prehistory that the first headquarters of NATO were located in London, and that the first Secretary General of NATO was British, Lord Ismay, who is famous for his apocryphal dictum that the purpose of NATO is to keep the Americans in, the Russians out, and the Germans down. Now, precisely also because of this dictum, it is oftentimes perceived that NATO is perceived oftentimes as a one-issue organization dealing primarily with the challenges from the East. But in fact, the South was very much on the minds of the alliance from the very beginning. In fact, so much so that even to this date, the shortest ever application procedure and admission procedure for any NATO ally took place in 1952 when both Turkey and Greece joined the alliance. And they joined it because of the assessment that the Soviet threat for Turkey in those days was too great to let it just be, and that it was very important to prevent the Soviet side from having unimpeded access to the Mediterranean. Later on, the Mediterranean developed into some sort of a competition between the American Sixth Fleet on the one side and the Allied forces on the NATO side, and the so-called Fifth Squadron or the Fifth Escadra of the Soviet side, which at one point, especially in the 70s, was strong and encountered about 50 ships. This presence of NATO in the Mediterranean, and by the way, the key command post for that presence is in Naples. It's the Joint Force Command in Naples. That presence also continued for the first couple of years after the end of the Cold War, and was actually used to great effect also in the operations against the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, especially when it comes to some of the most important air sorties. But even though this particular physical presence then started to dwindle, the South remained very much on the alliance's mind, not only through a number of partnerships such as the Mediterranean Dialogue, which was established quite soon, already in 1994, but also because of what happened soon afterwards, and we all remember 9/11, 2001. So that was the first case of the invocation of Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty. Soon followed by, in succession, invocations of Article 4, which is political consultations by Turkey. We have had so far 9 times the Article 4 being invoked, and 5 times it was by Turkey in connection with the events in the south. And that is also why we say today that NATO deals with 2 main threats, and those are threats from the east and threats from the south. And I'm emphasizing this because sometimes there is a general impression that the Mediterranean and the south in general is not something that is in the focus of the alliance as such. But let me return to the issue of transport. Transportation routes have always been extremely important for the alliance. Why? Because when the alliance was created, the problem of NATO was a lack of strategic depth. As you know, we had West Germany, and then already Benelux countries, and then we already had the Atlantic. And in that sense, the former SACLAN, or the commander for the Atlantic, now known as the Supreme Commander for Transformation, was really responsible for keeping the Atlantic free for reinforcements for the United States in case of an actual outbreak of major fighting. So transport issues have always been in the background of the alliance thinking when it comes to security policy, should we say, of the collective West. Also, when it comes to reinforcements in case of a conventional war in Europe. And I'm talking here about arrangements with railways, with special railway cars for tanks being ready for deployment and for usage. But this is what then changed when NATO went out of area. The NATO of Cold War is now being called NATO 1.0. The expeditionary NATO is now being called NATO 2.0. And I'm mentioning this now because we're in the process of going to NATO 3.0, which will actually quite much resemble NATO 1.0. But what happened with during the expeditionary phase? As you know, there was a big emphasis on deployable capabilities. And all of that was based on this belief, which was also mentioned before, about some sort of an end of history and of the entire world converging on the same set of values, meaning that the real purpose of NATO was not really anymore deterrence and defense in Europe, but becoming the hub of a global security network. And that, for instance, was the idea behind the Chicago summit of 2012. But then, as you know, in 2014, a rude awakening took place with the annexation of Crimea and the incursion of the Russian side in eastern Ukraine. And it really caused a shock within the alliance because it required rebuilding institutional memory from the past, which was in a way, to a certain extent, forgotten because of this expeditionary period, which required also rethinking of the way to fight in the future, and which also required a really major focus on transport. Why? There was this hope at the very beginning of the Russian annexation of Crimea that the Russians will come back to their senses, and also on account of sanctions, they will change their policy, but that what is needed is some sort of a reinforcement of the eastern flank of the alliance. And what the solution was thought to be was some sort of a reinforcement which was there but was not there. In a way, a reinforcement which can be easily deployed. And that was the idea behind the so-called spearhead of NATO brigade that could be deployed quickly with 2 additional brigades to the Baltic states in case of need. The problem which arose immediately during the planning was that people came to the realization that it is actually very difficult to transport this sort of number of troops and equipment to the Baltics because of the procedures in Germany, because of the state of railways in Poland and in the Baltic states, and so on and so on and so forth. So that is also why already in 2017, after the Warsaw Summit, the 7 areas of cooperation between the European Union and NATO, and I have to say that European Union and NATO really started cooperating after 2014 because that emergency basically alleviated the Turkish Cypriot, shall we say, negative approach to NATO-EU coordination. So it was decided that one of the key areas of cooperation between the EU and NATO is military mobility. Basically, that the EU provides the funds for the transport corridors that the alliance needs to reinforce its eastern flank. And this is something which is ongoing and, of course, which is also quite important. But in addition to that, so we say the collective West soon started coming to the realization that new type of warfare is basically more and more hybrid, and it also requires more and more resilience. This was noticed already in 2016 when cyberspace became one of the operational domains of NATO. Then, of course, in 2019, when outer space also became one of the operational domains of the alliance. But still, the realization that infrastructure plays an increasingly important role became more and more evident as years passed by. And there was a big difference between NATO 3.0 and NATO 2.0, because during the NATO 2.0 period, whenever a newer member of NATO, for example, from former Eastern Europe, would argue within NATO committees for investments in some critical infrastructure or aircraft, the answer would be, we should be investing in brains, not in bricks. Okay. So this major transformation has been occurring over the past several years. And it, in a way, culminated in 2022, the creation of the Resilience Committee and the definition of the 7 categories of resilience that all the countries need to be attentive to. And the first one is the continuity of government. Then you have energy supply. Then you have the ability to deal with migrant flows in the case of war. Then you have provision of food and water. Then you have health, of course, provision of health. And then you have communication and transport. And I'm mentioning this because every 2 years, members of the alliance play a kind of crisis management exercise called CMX. And the last crisis management exercise, which was played in 2025, was extremely indicative because during the 4 days of the exercise, the kinetic attack came only the last day. But during the first 3 days, what you had was within this scenario, and it was really surprising for the allies, you had constant attacks on communication and transportation centers, most of them very difficult to attribute, most of them done with drones and similar equipment. And the way that this had an impact was like a long-range artillery barrage, but extremely unnerving. And in that sense, I would say it is not surprising also that already within the new strategic concept of the alliance, which is the second most important document of the alliance, there is great emphasis on logistics, transportation, and the defense of critical infrastructure. So if I were to kind of wrap up and give an answer to your question, security policy today, first of all, has been reborn. Because after the end of the Cold War, it seemed as if security policy is almost outdated or not even needed anymore. And that was especially obvious within an organization such as OSCE, Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, with the so-called first basket, which is security and military basket, was almost overlooked on account of the third basket, which deals with human issues. So security policy has been reborn, but has been reborn in a different way. It is now more comprehensive. It is all of society and all of government approach. And in this context, I would say that the topic of this conference is right on. It is extremely topical, and indeed, it is difficult these days to talk about geopolitics without talking about transport and logistics. Thank you.